Gracious Father, thank you for everyone that you've gathered today. Thanks for this beautiful day. You know what we may have carried in this morning in terms of just pain and heaviness. We're so grateful that you know that and that you are so loving, a love that pursues us, as we just sang about. So I would just pray that we would sense that, open our hearts to sense that this morning, and that we might leave encouraged and empowered for this tough world that we live in. So open our eyes and our hearts to what you want to teach us today. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I am going to return for a third week to a topic that has just fascinated me. We're integrating those disciplines of theology and therapy. We've been talking about the lost language of sin and grace. The language of sin, it is true, is increasingly being replaced in our culture. This is review for us here. The language of sin is being replaced in our culture. We have this treatment community, the therapy community, theology. In the treatment community, they use the word sickness, the medical model, the disease model, the model of the 12-step recovery groups. The therapeutic community emphasizes symptoms because the emotions and behaviors that we have display may be symptomatic of deeper hurt and brokenness that needs to be addressed. And the theological term for the core malady of humanity is sin. So I ask the question, are we sick? Are we sinful? Secular psychologist Albert Ellis, and I would read Ellis because he comes from this cognitive behavioral school, which is how I think, but Ellis called Christians emotionally disturbed, usually neurotic, and sometimes psychotic. And sometimes we are. But so are non-believers. He also believed that the concept of sin was the cause of virtually all psychopathology. And so obviously there are times where these three sort of trains of thought are far apart and they're opposed to one another. But as I said last week, I believe it's the integration of all three perspectives that is most helpful to bring people to maturity and wholeness. In fact, I don't know how we can do discipleship in our society today that is so broken, people are so wounded, without integrating all three of those perspectives. And I've been saying in this series that when we lose the language of sin, what we lose is how amazing God's grace is. We can't comprehend the amazingness of God's grace apart from our sinfulness. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. All right, that's review. You ready to continue? One of the enduring influences of Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna is their notion of defense mechanisms. Not a real complicated concept, but it does make sense. Defenses shield us. And we all live behind armor, protecting ourselves from the painful realities and from painful truths. We protect ourselves with selective forms of self-deception. We protect ourselves with selective forms of self-deception. We explain those painful realities and truths about ourselves in a way that take the blame off of ourselves and puts it somewhere else. And many different sorts of defenses have been labeled and defined by psychologists. You can go online, you can find the self-help books that talk about defense mechanisms. But the easiest example to see of a defense mechanism, if I tell myself I'm just a social drinker instead of dealing with my serious problem of alcohol, my defense mechanism is denial. Denial is a form of self-deception so that I don't have to deal with the painful reality that I'm an addict, a sloppy drunk. So in denial, I'm just a social drinker. rationalization, dissociation, regression, repression, displacement. There's just this long list of defense mechanisms, again, by which we refuse to face the truth about ourselves. And people wear armor for a reason. It can be painful to take an honest look at ourselves. But we're not going to make progress in our lives until we do. It's through those defense mechanisms that we remain blind to the truth about ourselves. In fact, we'll even talk about having blind spots. We all have blind spots. I like this cartoon. Reality. It's been my one terrible blind spot for years. True. I don't have to deal with reality because I'm sitting at a bar and making myself feel good. There we go. That's it. That's a defense mechanism. From a theological perspective, what we're talking about now is referred to as the noetic effect of sin. You don't hear many messages about the noetic effect of sin. Noetic comes from the Greek word nous, or nas, which is the word for mind. And so the noetic effect of sin is referring to sin's effect upon our mind, upon our thinking. Our thinking has been corrupted as a consequence of the fall of Adam, way back in the garden. Everything was affected, and our thinking was affected. Sometimes the Bible refers to our mind as, or our thinking as, the futility of our thinking, or the darkness of our minds. Noetic effect of sin. Classic example out of Romans chapter 1. For although they knew God, although they knew of God, that is, because God has revealed himself in the universe through just the wonder of creation and the complexity of creation. There must be a designer. Although they knew of God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. Their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. The mind, our thinking, and our heart, our will, all has been affected by sin. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. And note the self-deception there. They thought they were wise. That's part of the noetic effect of sin. We don't see our own foolishness. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and so God gave them over. God said, you may have your way. If that's what you choose to believe, God gave them over to a depraved mind. Another passage about the noetic effect of sin. 1 Corinthians 2, familiar passage again. The person without the Spirit, that is the non-believer, because if you're a believer, the Spirit resides within you. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolish and cannot understand because they are discerned. Obviously, he's talking about the mind all the way through here. Cannot discern because they're only discerned through the Spirit. People cannot properly understand the spiritual things or the Word of God until they experience the regenerating, illuminating work of the Spirit, and the Spirit resides in us. But even after that moment of salvation, Christians, we are still unable to completely be objective about ourselves because our reasoning is still hindered by the noetic effect of sin. Our own fallen nature impacts our thinking, and it impacts our reasoning, and it prevents us from an honest evaluation of ourselves. And see, I think this is where the integration of those disciplines, psychology and theology, can be so useful. There is benefit to both. And we need to have that trusted friend, that safe friend, to help reveal those defensive mechanisms to point out this might be a blind spot for you. But even after that, we have to realize underneath those defensive beliefs, underneath those behaviors, is still the ingrained sinfulness of humanity. What are you going to do about the sin? Some defense mechanisms, like dissociation, that's sort of a mental disconnecting with time and people, and repression, this sort of unconscious blocking of painful thoughts and feelings. Dissociation, repression, they are armor used because we have been sinned against. Some people cope with the trauma of being abused as a child, for example, with those defense mechanisms of dissociation and repression. But other defense mechanisms like denial and rationalization, they're from our refusal to acknowledge our own sinful behavior. And again, without doing that hard work of taking a look at ourselves, both from that psychological perspective and from that theological perspective of sin, we cannot experience grace and freedom and forgiveness. So that makes sense? Let's try to illustrate it with just one of my favorite parables. It's a story that illustrates just how blind we can be to our own sin and actually how we compensate and hide our own insecurities and our truth through defense mechanisms. Luke chapter 18. Luke begins with an explanation of why Jesus tells the parable. We all know this parable. So good. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went out to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector, the breaker of the law, the traitor to his nation, despised by the Jewish people, the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So imagine the scene. It is one of the hours of prayer, one of the 3 daily appointed times when every devout Jew went to the temple to pray. And when they were gathered, a priest would sacrifice a lamb as a symbol of atonement for the sins of the people. After the sacrifice had been offered, the priest would then burn incense, and as the smoke rose, it was a symbol of the people's prayers rising up to their God. So a steady stream of petitioners flows through the western gate, past the outer courtyard of the Gentiles and into the inner courtyard of the Jews. A despised tax collector finds himself caught up in this current of people and is swept along with them. Once inside the temple grounds, however, his steps grow timid. This is unfamiliar ground. This is holy ground. In self-consciousness, he retreats to the shadows of the marble columns bordering the courtyard. And in the safety of those shadows, his eyes pool with tears, his head falls forward, and remorse spills from his soul and spots the floor beneath him. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. In contrast to that, the Pharisee also comes to pray. He comes every day at each one of the appointed hours of prayer. He takes his usual position in the center of the courtyard, his usual spot. As he prays, he looks neither upward in worship or downward in remorse, he looks side to side in order to compare himself to the others who have gathered there. His eyes read the scrawl of sin written so legibly upon their faces, and he is pleased with the comparison. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. Look at me, the Pharisee prays. I have kept and exceeded all of the law, unlike the rest of all of these people. The Pharisee makes a downward, prideful comparison. We do one or the other. We can make upward comparisons. When I look at Facebook and see all the fun that you guys are having, and then I feel envious, or I can make a downward comparison and go, I am so much better than you. The Pharisee makes a downward comparison, and he specifically singles out a tax collector to highlight his own moral superiority. The essence of pride is that we place ourselves above others. We compare and make a list of all of those who rank below us. Comparison is a defense mechanism. It's a defense mechanism by which we refuse to face the truth about ourselves. And the noetic effect of sin affects our ability to even see the truth that is so prideful. What you're doing is so prideful. We convince ourselves through the defense mechanism of comparison that we are above average. Most all of us see ourselves as smarter than we really are. We also perceive ourselves to be more morally upright and moral than other people. You know, by definition, we're average. Most people are average on just about every trait, from intelligence to likability. People cluster around the middle of this bell-shaped distribution. You've seen the bell graph. And we cluster in the middle there. For example, let's take intelligence. 68% of the people are in this bell-shaped curve right here. On an intelligence test, is rated between the numbers 85 and 115. 68% of the people are going to be right there. 16% of us will be above, and 16% of us will be below that bell-shaped curve in terms of our intelligence. Now, if we perceived ourselves accurately, then when asked, how intelligent are you? 68% of us would put ourselves somewhere in that average range. 16 would be above, 16 would be below. But that is not what happens when people are asked how intelligent they are. Most people, almost everyone, will say they are at least average, and way more than 16% of us will say, well, we're above average. And that's not only true for intelligence, but for almost every positive trait that we can measure. In fact, a research study offered some fascinating examples of inflated self-assessment. That's what we're talking about. Inflated self-assessment. Here's my favorite example. College professors. Certainly the educated elite in this country are going to have accurate perceptions of their ability. Right? No. When college professors were asked to rate the quality of their teaching, 2% rated themselves as below average. 10% saw themselves as average. 63% described themselves as above average. 25% said they were truly exceptional. That is, of course, statistically impossible. How do you explain that? It's the arrogance of academia. It is the noetic effect of sin. Sinfulness affects our ability to think and to reason accurately, and our sinful nature is bent towards pridefulness. I just love that illustration. Because, no, I won't go there. Academia is so arrogant. It really is, and they just do not see it. Our prideful tendency towards self-serving comparison has implications for every area of our functioning. In the midst of an argument, for example, have you ever heard your spouse say, your opinion is better reasoned than mine? No, we don't say that. We say, I can't believe how stupid you are being. Why can't you see it the right way? Which means my way. In our noetic inability to see our own sin of pride, we assume our opinions are better than those of others. It's our defense mechanism to protect our fragile ego. I just don't really want to know the truth about myself, so I have these very strong defense mechanisms. Romans chapter 12. Do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. Now that does not mean that as Christians we're supposed to go around thinking, oh, I'm just such a worm. Not at all. Do not think more highly than you ought. But when I understand God loves me so much and God has been so gracious to me, I have a pretty healthy sense of image as a child of God. But not an inflated, prideful sense, because I realize I'm a sinner in need of grace. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. Our tendency is always to see others as the sinners that they are, and to see ourselves as the perfected saints that we're not. And so Augustine would say, my sin was all the more incurable because I did not judge myself to be a sinner. Or C.S. Lewis, I love this quote, as long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. Yet our tendency is to look side to side, make those comparisons, then look down. And as long as we're looking down, we cannot look up to see God. Okay, back to the parable, Jesus' parable. The tax collector would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast. Now, in those days, the posture prayer was to come with your hands folded across your chest. Everyone do that. And then with your head down. That was a posture of an outward display of your inward humility. Okay? And the tax collector in the parable, however, is like this, but he's not keeping his hands still. He is beating his chest, the text says. Now that was a custom in the Middle East in those days. People would close their fists and strike them in repeated fashion against their chest. That gesture was used in times of extreme anguish and grief, but it was never used in prayer. And that gesture is only found twice in the New Testament, both in the book of Luke, one in just a couple chapters. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to it in just a moment. God, have mercy on me, a sinner, he prayed. God, have mercy on me. God, extend your undeserved kindness to me. Again, we do not want justice. We are guilty. We want mercy. We want what we do not deserve, which is mercy. But what we receive is what not only we do not deserve, but we cannot deserve it. We receive grace. Remember this from last week? This is so good. I'll just do it again very quickly. There is kindness, just benevolent, charitable acts. Kindness. As a subset of kindness, there is mercy. Mercy is kindness to those who don't deserve it. As a subset of mercy, there is grace. Grace is God's undeserved kindness to those who cannot deserve it, or those who do not deserve it and cannot deserve it. You cannot earn it. You cannot work for it. You can't merit it on any of your behavior. Grace is God's merciful kindness to those who do not deserve it and cannot deserve it. We are saved by grace, not by works. We're saved by grace. Now, back to that, the only other time that this gesture of beating your chest, this indication of sorrow and anguish, only used one other time in the New Testament. A couple of chapters later, Luke chapter 23. Right after Jesus has died on the cross, the Roman soldier who has watched Jesus die comes to this point of spiritual clarity. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man, an innocent man." And when all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breast and went away. I believe Luke wants the reader to draw the conclusion that it takes something of the magnitude of the cross. It takes the sacrifice. It takes the shedding of blood to evoke this response in us regarding our sin and the wonder of God's grace. He wants us to see. He wants us to have an awareness of the gravity of our sinfulness instead of engaging in those defense mechanisms that we use as armor to protect ourselves, those defense mechanisms that prevent us from seeing our true selves. Instead of denying sin, rationalizing it away, engaging in some sort of religious effort, it is the awareness of sin that leads us to receive that gracious gift of salvation. Jesus draws the conclusion for the listeners to the parable. And by the way, we always point out how awful the Pharisees were. The Pharisees in that culture in some ways were the heroes. They were looked up to as the very spiritual, religious people. They expected the Pharisee to be the hero in this story and the tax collector who they despised to be the villain. But here's the conclusion. I tell you that this man, the tax collector, the one who acknowledged his sin, the one who requested mercy, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified before God, in a right standing with God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. It's a powerful parable about defense mechanisms and that noetic effect of sin, and just how amazing grace is. That God would send his Son to die for sinful humanity who did not deserve it, who could not deserve such a gracious gift. Comments or questions? Okay, you want some homework? Go find that trusted friend this week and say, hey, I want you to tell me, what are my blind spots? Do you see me using any defense mechanisms from taking that good hard look at myself? Seriously, why don't you do that? If you do that with your husband or wife, then give me a call for marriage counseling. We'll work on that. Can I ask you to do this again? Let's pray. Father, we are just so grateful and fill our heart with gratitude this morning that you have been so merciful to us, so gracious. We come into this Easter season and we're so vividly reminded of the great cost of grace. Grace is not cheap. It took your Son to the cross. Thank you for that gift. If there's anyone who doesn't know for sure they got a relationship with the Savior, that someday they'll be in heaven, the words are, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Can't do it on my own. I need a Savior. Thank you for the good news. And all God's people said, Amen. Thanks for worshiping with us today. Do not rush off. This is important just to hang out and encourage one another. I love you guys. Have an awesome